All right, good evening. The time is 6 p.m. and I'd like to call to order the September 16th, 2020 Keizer Planning Commission meeting. City Recorder's noted attendance. First order of business is the approval of the August 12th, 2020 minutes. Is there a motion on the minutes?
So moved.
Second.
Got a motion by Commissioner Whalen, second by Commissioner Callier. Any discussion on the minutes? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Thank you as always, Debbie. Our next order of business is appearances of interested citizens. We have two in the audience. Anybody signed up tonight, Debbie?
Oh, I forgot to get that. Sorry.
I guess I could just say, Carol, are you going to chat with us today? No?
And Jane, want to introduce yourself?
All right, Jane, come on up real quick and introduce yourself.
Hello, Jane Herb, newly appointed to the Planning Commission, so I'm super excited about that, and I'll look forward to officially starting next week, so I'm just sitting in today to observe. Any questions for me? Hi, Mark.
Nope, glad to have you here, and I know that I reached out to, I think it's Francisco, right? And he wasn't going to be able to make it, so we'll make sure he gets a copy of the video so he can be apprised of all the wonderful things that we're going to hear tonight. So thanks, Jane. All right, we have no public hearing tonight, so we're going to go ahead and shift over to the staff report here in just a second, but I just wanted to take a quick second and thank everybody for the changing in the schedule. I know that we had kind of an interesting week last week with all the smoke and everything else, but it's good that we could still arrange our schedules as such to be able to be here and talk about this. So thank you for taking that opportunity. And I was going to do it at the end. You want to do it? Should we do it now or at the end?
Yeah, let's do it now. That way they can eat them while they're listening to Shane.
Debbie wants cookies. So we have cookies here provided by the city, and it's to thank Commissioner Whalen and Commissioner Wilson for their time. Tonight will be their last Planning Commission meeting, so Frank, get your cookie and let's get this thing rolling.
No, it goes that way. Take yourself a cookie and go that way.
All right, while those are going around, Shane, what do we got?
Okay.
I'm missing the joke.
Yeah. No, it's shame. I blame the lawyer. It's the attorney's fault. Yeah. So tonight, we're not having a public hearing, but I wanted to take an opportunity to chat with you all about efficiency measures. I will say that I believe that Chair Lawyer oversold it a bit in saying it's all kinds of wonderful things that we're going to talk about tonight, but I think it's an important conversation to have. And, so in the staff report's pretty brief. I try to keep them to a page. I included in the packet a copy of our residential single-family zone, as well as the River Cherry Overlay District, which is our new district that we created, that got adopted in, I think it was December, which within the River Cherry Overlay District, we adopted some pretty good efficiency measures for single-family dwellings in the single-family zone, reducing some lot size, allowing additional ADUs, reducing parking requirements, kind of all of the things that generally fall into that efficiency measure category. And so I wanted to provide those to you just as a frame of reference of what can be done, and then the RS zone is just what our existing standards are. And really my goal of tonight's meeting is to get some feedback from all of you commissioners as to where you see us being currently and where you want to see us go in the near future. As you know, at the end of June of last year, we completed our housing needs analysis and buildable lands inventory. And to no surprise of anyone that was involved with that project who has lived in Keizer for any amount of time, whoa, big surprise, we do not have enough land to accommodate projected growth in the next 20 years. Obviously, we're very built out. most neighborhoods are done. We don't see a lot of big subdivisions come in because there's not a lot of large vacant parcels left. So through that process, and we weren't able to adopt the study formally because we show this deficit. But part of, and we talked about it a year ago, but part of what came out of that was kind of a draft strategy to address some of those growth items. And in that strategy, in that document, there were kind of 4 strategies listed. One being to increase allowable densities, or at least evaluate the possibility of increasing allowable densities, encouraging a broader mix of housing types. There was a strategy about housing affordability that had a few different elements in it, one of which was reduction of parking requirements. And then a 4th strategy of funding and some creative financing, reduction of SDCs, construction excise tax kind of concepts, some things, urban renewal district possibilities. And so tonight I wanted to talk kind of specifically about the efficiency measures that can be kind of gained within the existing confines of the development code and changes that might be helpful to add a little bit. One of the things as I looked at that, we've had the RCOD on the books now for a little while, 6, 8 months, I guess, almost 9 months. And we haven't seen a ton of development within that River Cherry overlay district. Now, about a month ago, actually, we just issued the final hearings officer's decision last week. It came in, and it was a parcel that was on Sunset Avenue, and they were dividing it into 5 lots, and they are taking advantage of the smaller lot size provisions. They're proposing, and it's not a requirement of the approval, but what they've indicated is they're proposing that they're going to actually build homes with attached accessory dwelling units. So kind of duplex-like, but not a duplex. And they're looking at doing that as, an investment strategy and a return on their investment as a developer. And that's really the first subdivision we've seen come in. And, we received a decent amount of comments from the neighbors about concerns about density, concerns about parking, concerns about the impacts to the neighborhood fabric. And I think that realistically, we're at a point where we always get those concerns with residential land use. I mean, it's just something that happens when your backyard changes, And I think that there's a sensitivity that's needed. And then at the same time, I think when this is where it's a hard job for Planning Commission, frankly, because there's another overarching requirement of state law, land use planning, just rules and compulsion that we get put under to be as efficient and using the land that we have as efficiently and effectively as possible because of the housing situation that's in the whole state of Oregon and really the nation. So kind of 3 other things I really wanted to talk about tonight was your feel on the possibility of reducing minimum lot sizes outright in that RS zone. How do I say it right? I guess the sensitivity to reduction in parking standards and what might be appropriate or might not. And then the other piece is that middle housing element, that different type of housing and the gauge for how we feel in existing neighborhoods with infill getting changed. Now, interestingly enough, this morning I got an email, because I'm on these email lists, and the model code for large cities regarding House Bill 2001, which we've kind of talked about, it's that elimination of residential zoning in the state of Oregon bill, the duplex bill, if you will. They just published it, and there's going to be a public hearing at the end of the month on some proposed OARs and a proposed model code. And literally I got it today, and I was going through it looking, because I've been curious to see what are they going to land on. And Obviously, it's still in process, so it's not a finished product yet. But I think the reality is that no matter what we do in the next year or so, by June of 2022, we will have compulsion to do more than what we're doing right now. And so some of the things in the model code that I kind of looked through really quickly, basically it's saying, hey, duplex is going to be allowed anywhere a single family home is allowed, and a triplex is going to be allowed, and the largest minimum lot size that a city can apply in the draft, 5,000 square foot lot for a triplex, 7,000 square foot lot for a fourplex, which it's a little lower than I would have thought just off the top of my head. But that's kind of what they're proposing as this kind of first putting it out there into the public comment and hearing process. So that was the discussion I kind of wanted to have, and I wanted to get some feedback from you all. Just as a frame of reference, there's been some things in my own mind that I think are somewhat doable. Right now in our residential single family zone, our minimum lot size is 5,000 square feet for detached dwellings. And you can go down to 4,000 square feet for an attached dwelling or a zero side yard dwelling. We've talked for a few years as staff about whether or not maybe that number should drop down a little ways. Salem has a minimum lot size of 4,000 square feet, but then you look at cities like Corvallis and Silverton, and they have larger lot sizes. So I don't know that there's a one size fits all or a magic number, but my feel has been, okay, that RCOD grab that we just did to truly look and say, okay, in this area, we're going to see greater density, or we want to allow for that true greater density. When we initially adopted it, there was some talk of, well, should those properties be fully upzoned, or should these standards be applied across the board? And personally, I don't know that our city is there quite yet. I think that may carry a little more density and impact than our city is maybe ready for. But I will say in the last 2 years, we've approved a couple of subdivisions and partitions where lot sizes did go below 5,000 square feet for a few of the lots. And it was interesting because if you go and you look at those built out projects, you generally don't really see a difference because setbacks aren't changed, lot coverage isn't changed. It basically affects how large of a home gets put on it. So those, really those were the kind of the three elements that I wanted to talk with you guys about to kind of get a feel for where you're at from a policy setting perspective. Obviously, there's no deliberation or anything like that to talk it through, and any amendments we bring to future meetings, obviously I'd be bringing a recommendation with some supporting documentation and information from other jurisdictions to kind of give you a broader frame of reference. But what I didn't want to do is I didn't want to just come at you with, hey, let's eliminate parking requirements, if that's a kind of a dead in the water kind of feel. With that, I guess it's a little weird because there's no true actionable items, but that is really what I'm kind of looking for from you all as far as some feedback on where you feel and it may be that you feel that, hey, you know what, we've seen the partitions over the years and we feel like we're at the place that's as far as we should go as a city, and that's okay too. The one thing that's a little hard is that, as I said, in our draft strategies document that was born out of that housing needs analysis and buildable lands inventory, that the project advisory committee actually made a formal recommendation to say, hey, we need to accommodate our growth within that existing UGB. We're not interested in going out and doing a large scale expansion. And the advisory committee actually made that kind of as a formal-ish recommendation as a part of that strategy. And I think that's ultimately, we've been talking about it for 20 years in Keizer, and ultimately that is the giant elephant in the room, is the urban growth boundary situation that we're in. And while we're not going to solve that issue tonight for sure, the efficiency measures, if we adopted some efficiency measures and maybe rolled back some of the requirements in our code somewhat, we're moving toward allowing a little more within our confines, but it's clearly not going to resolve the issue we have of the fact that we do not have enough land, and even with efficiency measures, it's not going to create much capacity. I think what it could possibly do is create scenarios where some neighborhoods that have existing larger lots that right now they can't quite redivide or redevelop additional housing stock, they might be able to do something more than just adding an accessory dwelling unit. So with that, yeah, I would be open to any questions that you have, any comments that you have, and yeah.
Infill is real, change is real for people that get real nervous. As commissioners, we know that you're, behind the desk or in the shop, so to speak, and we're out and about doing our lives. And when people find out we're on a commissioner, and we get like 900 questions thrown at us, so we have to find that fine line of professionalism, and yet, we have a citizen asking these questions. And I live on East Keizer, behind the ball fields, the wilderness area, and I think the infill that people are concerned about is this. I was looking at the codes for noise, and it's, to my understanding, it's from 8 to 10, 08 to 10 p.m. And so when you put a triplex with minimal parking in that same space, people who have one lot, one house, tend to eye the panic button, because now you have more people on top of more people. And so, more specifically, my neighbor was working right up till 10 o'clock. Well, 10 o'clock is dark, and then 08, boom, hitting again. And so one thing affects another, in that when we bring more people in, we have to look at those things, because code says we can do this. Code says I can work at 08 and close at 1000. You see what I'm saying? And so we might want to look at that and say, okay, maybe we want to push back a little, an hour earlier, an hour later. See what I'm saying? To satisfy that, because we got to look at who's going to be living in these units. I don't think that Gary's going to move into a 3-level unit. You know what I'm saying? I don't see myself at 54 doing it. So they're younger crowds. That's what I see off the top of my head, Shane.
Mr. Rance?
I think I heard you say that, based on the model code, that for duplex uses on a single-family zoned lot, we'll be able to go down to a minimum lot size of 5,000 square feet. Do I understand that correctly?
Actually, what the model code says is that wherever a single family home is allowed, a duplex would be allowed too. So whatever your minimum lot size is for a single family home. So in our case, it's 5,000 currently for a detached single family dwelling. So yes, and what's really interesting is that they also define duplexes as they have these kind of pictures and layouts. They have a detached duplex. So it's just 2 houses. It's literally 2 houses on a lot. So, yeah. So again, this is like, literally, I got the email today, followed the links, pulled up, because I've been waiting to see what is the model code gonna look like, because they put out the one for the smaller cities, and it was, in the bill, smaller cities have to allow duplexes wherever a single-family home is allowed, but they did not have the requirement that we as a larger city have, and that's to allow middle housing, which is your triplex, quads, cottage clusters, townhouses. Those have to be allowed. In the bill, it says residential areas. But in the rulemaking process through the OARs, they've kind of drilled down and have proposed language to define what that really means. And that's where I've been intrigued to go, well, what kind of flexibility are we going to have as a city ultimately when this thing lands to say, okay, this is where it might be appropriate for the larger triplex, fourplex, cottage clusters versus just the I was pretty certain that duplexes were going to have to be allowed everywhere because that's what they did to small cities. I was a little surprised that they are defining duplex as essentially 2 units on a lot, whether or not they're attached or detached. So, I'm sorry, Jeremy, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, but the follow-up, we're going to be able to set minimum lot sizes for triplexes and quads.
So in the model code, the way I read it, it basically says that for a triplex, it cannot be greater than 5,000 for your minimum lot size. For a fourplex, it cannot be greater than 7,000. There is a caveat, and I'm going to have to dig into it a little bit more because part of their rulemaking, they went through and actually have looked at all the different cities and looked at their land use zoning and used GIS to drill down and go, okay, here's your zoning and this is the size of the parcels. So there's actually a breakdown in one of the technical appendices that has us in it. And, basically 90% of our lots are over 5,000 square feet because that's our minimum lot size, obviously. So there's a few that are less because we have some PUDs where smaller lot sizes were done, or we have some zero lot lines. But basically what they said in the model code and in the OARs is that if you don't go with that standard, then you may be able to go with a different standard, but you will have to demonstrate that at least 75% of all residentially zoned lots in your jurisdiction can have middle housing opportunities on them. And then there's kind of a further breakdown where it has to be within census tracts. You have to provide all the different housing types that are allowable at certain percentages. So looking at our chart from a quick 10-minute look and not doing a big technical analysis, from looking at our chart, I don't believe off the top of my head that the way our city's already parceled up, that we're going to have that flexibility to adopt a different lot size standard. I mean, from my perspective, honestly, when I read the bill, because it wasn't drilled down and defined, in my thought process, I was like, okay, I could see fourplexes or triplexes in a residential zone, maybe if it's on a transit street, if it's on a lot over 10,000 square feet, or some sort of kind of reasonable kind of way to look at it. I kind of was thinking we might have that amount of flexibility as a planning commission to come up with City of Keizer community standards. In reading this first draft, it doesn't propose that level of flexibility. Now, again, I'm expecting there to be some comments that get received on this thing from lots of jurisdictions. I have not even had time to really digest it, but that's a piece where I need to kind of consider what kind of comments do we, the city, need to submit to this public hearing process. Well,
that answers my question before I go to Commissioner Watson was, when you had said model code, to me that says it's already passed. So this is still in the rulemaking process.
Yeah, it's a total draft. The first public hearing at DLCD is at the end of the month.
So I'm wondering if, okay, I have a thought. Go ahead, Commissioner Watson.
Well, I want to follow up a little bit on what Commissioner Hostler was talking about. And at the risk of putting words in your mouth, I think you and I might be in and on the same wavelength as far as smaller lot sizes are a foregone conclusion, whether it's us shrinking them ourselves prior to HB 2001, or just waiting and seeing what the draft language comes up with, what the draft turns into, and then reacting to what that is. So acting proactively to resolve the kind of problems that might come up isn't a bad way to frame this, isn't a bad way to look at what we could be doing. But I think the sort of things that would be coming up are things that are outside of the purview of the Planning Commission. So, I mean, I don't know what we would be able to do for noise code, for example, but if we could get an idea of the kind of good neighbor codes that are out there that might need to be looked at when we're talking about good neighbors being great neighbors, that might be useful information for us. We don't want our code to be complaint driven, obviously, but if we can get an idea of the kind of things that we would predict would become issues from people, whether it's noise complaints, whether it's, we already know parking, obviously. But I think that might be helpful because then we could know what other commissions we would need to maybe partner with or communicate with in order to get ahead of it and maybe even use that as a selling point when we're talking to members of the public. We know this is going to happen. We think this is going to happen. Here's our proposal. Here's what it is. Here's your vegetables. Here's your dessert, though. Yeah. So that might be a useful bit of a decision-making framework for us. Thanks.
City Attorney.
Thank you, Chair. Most of you probably already know this, but a model code typically is just what's called a safe harbor. In other words, if you adopt that, then you won't be challenged. Not necessarily everything in the model code has to be adopted. I meant to bring the bill with me or look it over, and I forgot. The duplexes on, or triplexes even, on a single family lot, that's under the bill. You can't change that. I'm not positive about the 7,000. Is that in the bill too?
No, it's in the OARs.
Well, okay.
So.
But my point is that there may be portions of the model code that we're not going to be required to adopt.
Commissioner Keller.
Thank you, Chair. I kind of was going the same line as Commissioner Hustler and Commissioner Watson, but I was going from the standpoint of I'd kind of like to know where the city council is heading as far as traffic. A lot of what we do is going to be dependent on what our vision of mobility is in this community. We talk about parking. I look back to some of my experiences in San Diego or Chicago or a few other places that I've had to live for a short period of time or stayed for a short period of time, sometimes a couple months. But at any rate, every one of those places went through what we're doing 40 years ago from the standpoint of infill. And I'll just use the example of San Diego. It's a mess. And when I say that, I say you have apartment complexes that were constructed 20 years ago, which required one parking stall for each apartment. There isn't anybody in Southern California that has one car. Each one of those apartments have 2, 3, 4 different people living in them. Each one of them has a car. In that same neighborhood, you have people who have created auxiliary dwelling units for their in-laws and for rentals to be able to keep up with the costs. They have a car. They've turned their garages into another bedroom or into an office or whatever. So they don't park off street. They're all parking on the street. So all their planning of what they were doing as far as infilling and trying to get affordable housing and varieties of housing have great ideas, but a lot of the unintended consequences is that you have a tremendous traffic issue. I don't know what Keizer's traffic vision is. We hear about Salem's. Obviously, Salem doesn't want a third bridge. And Salem's doing some other things that are, I guess, trying to force people into using mass transportation, which I don't have any trouble with that. If I can use it and be able to accomplish the things I need to accomplish in my life. But the fact of the matter is if we don't know some of these things, information about neighbor, good neighbor, density rules, those kinds of things, I feel a little reluctant to give you a whole lot of input, because I think we did the right thing with the Cherry Avenue overlay. I think we've done the right thing in our changes that we've made so far, and I think we'll be making some additional changes to improve density. But I feel like there are pieces missing. And all of us, when we send something to the council, our goal has always been, this group has been great about, we go into a lot of detail. We try to figure out all the unintended consequences. And so when we give a product to the council, it is as complete as we know it. And even with that, they always have other questions and other ideas, and that's great. But if we were trying to do something today with the idea of the next few months sending the council some kind of changes, I don't think I'm there yet. I got too many questions, too many.
Well, and I think on a global perspective for the state, 2020 has offered a lot of reflection between COVID and now the fires over the last week. And I can tell you that transit was massively impacted by COVID initially, which meant that people in some situations were left without abilities to get to places, get to food, get to doctor's appointments, get to their jobs and things like that. They've seen in the last few months, actually, the number of car sales go up incredibly because people are like, look, we can't have access to what we would normally get to use. And so now people are going out and buying cars. I think the fires have created another issue. I spent the last week dealing with evacuees, and the number one issue was getting out of areas of concern. And I think that maybe with the smoke impacting Metro and some of these other areas where they don't typically get affected, hopefully somebody's going to start taking a look at this with a little bit more judiciousness and saying, okay, is stacking people on top of people on top of people ultimately in the best interest of safety for those same people? Because you look at communities like Gates and Lyons where houses are right next to each other. Some of them are larger houses. Detroit, decimated. And there's one way in, one way out. If you're coming, back into the valley, or if you're going east, one way in, one way out. And so one of the things that we started talking about just last week was, if Salem Keizer goes to a level 2, where do you go? Because guess what? The coast was on fire in some areas too. So I'm really hoping that in the rulemaking process, people are really taking a very cautious approach to some of these conversations and looking at the emergency nature. One of the things that's been on the tongues of Oregonians now for years has been the Cascadia quake. Well, we have hundreds of bridges throughout this state, most of which will probably go away in the event that Cascadia happens. Well, wildfires happen every single year. Snow and ice throughout the state happen every single year, and it continues to become a challenge. If the winds pick up again next year, who knows? Salem and Keizer felt pretty safe over last week, but all it would have taken was 1 or 2 more days of pretty sustained wind, and we might be looking at a completely different situation than what we're seeing now. So I agree that mobility is a massive issue. You've got people stacked on top of each other with no way to get out. These city buses aren't going to be probably immediately available to get people and evacuees out of where they need to go. So I think that generally I agree. What is this going to look like? I mean, I agree that in 3 months we might have some really good ideas of some things that we may want to do, but who's to say that we kind of put the cart before the horse a little bit? The rulemaking gets in, they kind of take a much more proactive look at this thing and looking at public health and safety as a land use goal, and recognize that maybe there's some better ways to look at things. So that's just kind of my 2 bits of thought on this. There's being proactive for the sake of being proactive, and I think we're doing a really good job. We got ahead of a lot of the things that came out before House Bill 2001, but I'd be really curious to see what the rulemaking's and the consequences of the rulemakings are going to be, personally, but. Commissioner Whalen.
Thank you. I think all the previous comments have value, but they come down to really creating more questions than answers. You know, what is Keizer going to look like? What are we going to do for transportation and mobility? And they all intertie. And when we look at the state saying, okay, you have to have a 20-year inventory of homes or of land for development, that's all well and good, but if you don't have the land, what is the state going to do? Are they going to pull the city's charter? I mean, urban growth expansion, the Citizens Committee very loudly said we want to work within the UGB, and that was essentially accepted, I believe, by the council at the time. And now we're looking at new rules that may or may not be put into place. As we see them now, you have a model code, which is the beginning, but it's a long way from really answering the questions. And how does Keizer respond to this? Do we respond to a model code absent of transportation configurations? We are still locked up with a joint UGB, and separating from that, we've looked at that. That's multi-millions of dollars that we have to be ready to spend. Basically, the day there is a divorce, we have to be in a position to do these things. So, I mean, selfishly, it's a great time to be going off the Planning Commission, because you guys have some very formidable challenges ahead of you. And I have confidence that with the people that currently sit there and the addition of new people, you'll be able to work through this, but it's not going to be as simple as checking off a box and saying, okay, we're going to have 4,500 square foot lots. We're going to have duplexes and triplexes in the middle of a block in a new subdivision. And yet, the law that's being proposed basically is telling us we have to do that. But the application of it is the challenge. And if Keizer or Salem or Lake Oswego or Silverton or Burns, whatever, is unable to create the land to do this, what are the consequences? What is the state going to do? And I've asked your predecessor that in the past, and they just kind of like, well, we have to do it. But what if we don't? What if it's not feasible to either get divorced from the common UGB, the shared UGB, or to expand because of, basically we could go north, which is prime ag land. And even though acreage yield productivity is much higher than it was 20, 30, certainly 100 years ago, it's still land that's supposed to be protected, is one of the highest priorities of the whole land use for the state of Oregon. So what are the consequences other than doing the best you can, and I'm confident that this body will, and the council will. Shane, do you have any idea of what, if you go to the state, I mean,
Sure.
Lake Oswego's been landlocked for decades.
Right.
So what are they doing there?
Yeah, and I don't know exactly if Lake O figures into part of Metro. But Metro, that whole group of cities is all a big shared UGB by essentially they all agree to it or whatever. And that is the one thing that we have that really no other city in the state of Oregon has, other than the metro cities. And that is because we share our UGB with Salem. If we truly just choose to say, we're not going to pursue a divorce or a separation from the overall UGB boundary, Right now, there is capacity within the UGB to accommodate the projected growth for both Salem and Keizer. So, I mean, theoretically, I guess what that means is ultimately if Keizer is built the way that it is, and it's built out the way that it is, and we make no changes to allow additional flexibility or efficiency, then the standards are the standards. And when the state, in June of 2022, if we don't make changes to align with the OAR provisions of House Bill 2001, whatever they end up with at the end, then theoretically what that means is that somebody can come in and they can build according to that model code if we haven't adopted standards that comply with it. And obviously when we go through a text amendment, those text amendments have to get acknowledged by the LCD at the end of our process after it goes to city council. It's basically, that's kind of the vetting of it. So I mean, I do think we're in a little bit of a unique situation in that, you know, I hear the concerns on transportation and all of those issues. And so yeah, there's a fine line, I think, but realistically, if we stand pat, so to speak, and adopt just whatever that minimum is that we have to adopt when it gets to that point, I mean, ultimately the state doesn't do anything to us because it essentially means it's an acknowledgement that the rest of the growth goes to Salem. Now there is kind of a process, I think, a formality that has to happen there that hasn't happened yet because we haven't been able to adopt our current housing needs analysis and buildable lands inventory. And I think I shared at the last meeting, we had just gotten a intergovernmental agreement because we got a grant to do an update to our housing needs analysis and buildable lands inventory to do kind of a technical update based on our RCOD adoption. I'm actually going to have a kickoff meeting with the consultant group next week on that to get that process rolling. And so my anticipation is at the end of that new technical analysis and update, we will be in a position to be able to say, okay, this is what our need is. We can update our comp plan and adopt this new housing needs analysis. And just like it is in our comp plan right now, where it says we don't have enough land in our projected area to accommodate the growth, but the shared UGB does, so we can adopt it and move forward. And then we're under no compulsion from the state to have to expand our boundary immediately.
City Attorney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Gary, Shane answered most of your question, I think, and the part that I would add is basically, I think your question in terms of what the state would do as a practical matter is moot in a way because of what Shane mentioned. DLCD is not going to take a position that because Keizer didn't grow at all, that they're going to slap us somehow as long as there's room in Salem as a practical matter. The other thing I was going to comment on, though, is hypothetical, because lawyers love hypotheticals, of course. And a story some of you might have heard is early this century, I did some work for the city of St. Paul, and they are serious when I say they, DLCD and LCDC in this case, about making sure, I mean, a lot of cities are trying to grow too much, right? Try to expand too much, but they want you to have that 20-year supply. In St. Paul in 2002 or 2003, when I was doing work for them, it was really more of a battle between the city and a particular developer, but they chose not to expand the UGB, and they actually had growth issues. And St. Paul's report said a city can choose how they grow or not to grow at all. And I was there in the hearing, and LCDC, the actual commission, said, no, you can't choose to not grow at all. That's why that rule is there for the 20 years. And they do have some incentives and disincentives buried deep in the law. So, I mean, if we didn't have the Salem issue, then I don't think we could choose to not expand the urban growth boundary if the efficiency measures didn't take care of the growth. They would eventually either take us to court or do whatever incentives or disincentives that the state has. I don't see that, because of, like what Shane said, ever coming to pass, though.
Commissioner Keizer.
Thank you, Chair. When I first read this, I have to tell you, I did not anticipate this is the conversation we would have tonight. I was thinking maybe a little more nuts and bolts. So I'm looking at the three things that you want us to focus on. And I can see how we can have middle housing as a means of infill development based on what we're doing right now. I think that's available. Reducing minimum lot sizes below what we have now, I'm not sure that's what the community wants. And if we do reduce lot sizes and we do have infill, and if we do reduce parking requirements, we end up with that on-street parking, traffic mobility thing that mentioned earlier. So I can see one of these things as being doable the way it is now, but the others, reducing parking requirements, reducing minimum lot sizes, I'd have to have some education on how we can get that done.
I appreciate that, Mark.
So I have a hypothetical. I'm going to go to Commissioner Watson. So in my real life, jurisdictions have weighed in on rulemaking processes before. So hypothetically speaking, if we pivoted a little bit away from focusing on efficiency measures and rather started to come up with statements from the Planning Commission specifically related to this specific rulemaking, is that a consideration that could be looked at so that we could more proactively participate on the record below for this rulemaking process?
Is this your turn? Did you hear that question?
No, I was writing, sorry.
So in theory, if we're talking about the efficiency measures, but if this body felt that it was so important to participate in the rulemaking process as a jurisdiction, could we pivot to focusing on some of that language to comment on the rulemaking?
Oh, certainly.
So that the city of Keizer could.
There is a little technical issue with that, of course, is that typically that type of intervention should come from the council. So
Understood.
if this body wanted to suggest something, and that's an extra task that would probably fall to yours truly and to Shane. But if you felt that was appropriate to do, I am kind of cynical and pessimistic about any effect we would have. But could be wrong. Could be, we could bring up some good points on that. You need to remember, if you're talking about, I assume you're talking about finalizing the model code, right? Is that
Correct.
the issue you're getting at?
Affecting the administrative rules.
What's that?
Affecting the administrative.
Correct, yeah. So commenting on those specific rulemaking items during their public hearings and stuff, and then issuing.
As they relate to the model
Yes.
code. So remember that the commission and DLCD kind of have the right, as long as they're not straying outside the actual bill, to kind of come up with what they want. Now, if it is actually violating the statute in terms of what their authority is, then that's where you kind of can make a point, sure. But there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's been a long time since we tried something like that. I'm trying to remember how long ago that was or what the issue was, but.
Well, I just know on the energy side, we heard a lot from jurisdictions.
Oh, sure.
So just a thought to kind of tickle people's brains a little bit. Commissioner Watson. Nothing?
It's a little too hypothetical, too long-term.
Oh. Well,
Good offline conversation.
we're planning, right? Planning is kind of long-term. So, I mean, Commissioner Keizer brought up the issue specifically related to, I think it was the ADUs, is that correct? That's kind of a short-term thing that we could probably look at. I think generally speaking, I would agree that the density issue, or excuse me, the lot sizes piece and the parking piece is probably a little bit bigger of an elephant than I think we're necessarily ready to bite into at the moment, just from a personal perspective. I feel like with this whole process, it's a little bit of a, dog chasing its own tail, trying to figure out what we want to do. I mean, the state's saying thou shalt or thou may or whatever, and we're trying to be proactive, but the unintended consequences are varying, I think. Did you have something? Oh, I thought you raised your hand. Commissioner Keizer.
Well, I just wanted to emphasize, we have actually, on this commission, have done a few things ahead of the wave,
Right.
only to have to
Back up.
back up. And they were the right things to do at the time. I don't have any qualms about what we did. Could be maybe the same thing here. I just don't feel as confident with the information or my knowledge to really delve into it. And it sounds like, you know, what I'm hearing from staff and in my own experience is when you try to affect the creation of administrative rules, those administrative rules are formed by long before they show up on the staff hearing floor, with the idea that that's the direction that they are expecting to go.
Right.
And once in a while, things change, but not often. And I don't know if we have the bandwidth in Keizer to be able to, unless we just happen to find one or two things when Shane has a chance to look at this, one or two things that maybe we could affect. So I hate being reactive. I love being proactive. I hate being complaint driven. I love being proactive, but the reasonableness in me, which doesn't win out a lot, but in this particular case, it seems like we kind of have to wait and see.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One thing, following up, Matt, with your comment and Mark's comment on that, as I made a note, I'll check with the League of Oregon Cities to see if they have involvement in what their take is, because I have contacts there. Because they obviously carry the water for all of us. Right. It might be much more effective voice for the cities on that issue, and I'll report back to you.
Commissioner Austin.
Shane, in the past conversations you've had with Salem's planning, or Salem for that matter, in the UGB, how often do they ask you, how is your urban growth boundary infill doing?
They don't.
Ever? So they don't give you no love? Yeah.
Well, no, it's not really. I think that the Salem Keizer UGB is, it's kind of a big elephant in the room. Ultimately, market drives development more than just about anything else. And there's a huge difference in a city like Keizer, which was, for the most part, parcelized and populated before it was ever even a city. And, obviously we had a lot of growth in the 80s and 90s, but we also had a big base to begin with that was already subdivided up into neighborhoods. So I think they have a very different view and focus, clearly, and they have different needs as well. But the work that they're doing now, they're doing a big project called Our Salem. It's an update to their comp plan. They have invited our participation. I actually attended their meeting last week via Zoom. Nate was going to those meetings previously as part of the technical advisory committee. I know they just put some stuff out on their website for their visioning process they went through. And so, but realistically, there was a regional housing needs analysis and buildable lands inventory done way back in 2009? Do you remember? It might have been like 2009-ish, 10-ish, something like that. And then out of that, we drilled down, and they took a separate tack and drilled down for their section of the UGB. So, we have agreements in place where there's regional coordination that happens with comp plan changes and things like that. And realistically, even as we were going through our River Cherry Overlay District project, Nate and I had a few meetings with Salem staff to discuss the project. They actually helped with giving some examples of different mixed-use developments that were done in Salem to kind of look at how we might be able to achieve some of our housing needs, specifically outlined in our housing needs analysis that we just went through, of providing some additional multifamily housing, some additional condominium or townhouse style development, those different elements that kind of fall into middle housing or multifamily housing categories. So they actually were very helpful with that element. and giving us some data. And I think realistically, going through the process we did with the River Cherry Overlay District, we are looking to say, hey, we are changing zoning and updating our commercial zone to a mixed-use zone to allow additional multifamily growth specifically. Because I think that if the city were to have sat back and said, we're not doing anything, we're not going to add any efficiency to the River Cherry Overlay District, we're not going to even consider adjusting anything, Salem, you got to take all of our growth, you got to take all the multifamily need, you got to take all the residential single family need, you got to provide all the need. I think that might be hard for them to be able to do all of that. But I think, and this is where it is hard, because there's not a quantified magic number of how efficient a city should get. But I do think that we are under compulsion as a city, I'm under compulsion as a planner, as a planning commission, we are under a compulsion to do kind of, and I don't remember who said it, but basically do the best we can do, but at some level, that's maybe all we can do. And so I think that, realistically, I don't think that we're going to get some big pushback from Salem on it either. But, their focus is definitely right now on their big long-range project to look at, okay, how are we going to accommodate our growth within the area? We have had discussions that, yeah, and by the way, you're probably going to have to accommodate some of our growth too, and these are kind of the initial numbers. And so they're aware of that, and it's, it is what it is. So, I think they're a good partner. I just think it's a weird dynamic with the shared urban growth boundary.
I see it. My mind is thinking about, because as a small entity or a small city that is forced upon growth and infill, and we all know that we have to go somewhere, going up first and then north. I'm reluctant to have Salem say, oh, we need more growth, we need more acreage, so we're just going to go ahead and use our urban growth boundary for you to take that over and say, okay, we're going to help you force to go north. Do you see what I'm saying? And, oh, by the way, this is what we're doing for you. That's what I'm reluctant to see. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I think so. And realistically, I think that, the urban growth boundary lines were drawn in the 70s. I think it was Senate Bill 100 when it was passed, and they did it a lot based on existing urbanized areas. But then a huge element of that was what Councilor Whalen alluded to, and that was soil types. And so, ag lands, essentially you don't bring those into UGBs. Those are supposed to be farmlands. So the way the boundary got drawn, it went out into South Salem and some of East Salem area where maybe there's some more clay lands and hilly lands that aren't as prime for ag purposes. So that boundary got drawn, and I don't know, I use this analogy with my children because they're like, Dad, what do you do for a living? I'm like, I'm a land use planner. Well, what does that mean? Whatever. But it's sort of like they drew this big boundary, and our portion of this boundary is only this big. But the population growth from the region comes to the whole region. We are clearly a shared job shed. We're clearly a shared place for services. I grew up here, and I call downtown Salem. We don't have a downtown Keizer. We never have growing up here, and that's okay. But the reality is it's like the same flow of people have moved into the region, but they've concentrated in our area first, or it filled up faster. It's kind of like a 5-gallon bucket and a solo cup. You pour the same stream of water into them, the cup is going to fill up before the bucket is. But if you put them all together, it still is accommodating the same volume in its totality. So, I think that idea, Salem can't really give us growth to allow us to expand and to support an expansion. It would literally have to be a reduction or a shifting of that boundary, which my understanding, just isn't going to happen. So, I mean, realistically, now if Salem was in a different position and they were at the position we're at right now, and they were looking at not having a land supply and needing to expand, I mean, I think arguably at that point, if the boundary itself as a whole is getting expanded, that's where Keizer would need to be at the table very strongly to advocate for a fair share of that overall growth. The problem for us to justify it right now from a state system point of view is that we can't regionally justify there's a need for that growth outright. If we could, then that conversation would be, we wouldn't have the same options we have today. So, does that answer it for you?
I'm tracking, yes, sir.
Okay.
Commissioner Grants.
Thank you, Chair. I have a perception that I want to share, and I don't know if I'm looking big picture or getting too far into the weeds. But Keizer Development Standards includes infill development standards as a separate section. And most of the development land that's left is gonna fall into those infill standards. Those standards pretty clearly say that developing around previously developed lands, you can't exceed, I think it's 5 feet in average building height more than what you're developing around. If we're going to be required to allow triplexes on 5,000 square foot single family zone land, the only way to do that is to go up. What is that going to do to development around those previously developed lands?
That's a really good question. Yeah, there is some height provision language in there. I know there was talk about you had to allow at least 25 feet in height. I don't know if that was in the OAR or just in the model code provision, Jeremy, but I do, yeah, I honestly, I have the exact same, literally I saw the model code and I looked through and I was like, oh, they actually have lot sizes in the OARs. That's surprising, because generally, you know, there's a reality in government, and that local governments generally have some flexibility and capacity to kind of create standards that make sense for their communities. Now, a perfect example, Mark, you alluded to it earlier, sometimes we push things out and we adopt something and then we go, oh shoot, we have to change this. The perfect example was ADUs. We took a proactive approach to ADUs in Keizer. I thought that was the right thing to do. I still think it was the right thing to do. And we adopted standards, and we had big discussions about 2 specific points about ADUs: owner occupancy and parking.
Right.
And we landed on what I felt was a very reasonable parking standard. And that was one where we said, hey, if there's no available on-street parking, provide 1 space. And the owner occupancy, hey, Nate, he and I didn't see eye to eye on that one, but he advocated, and some of you all advocated, for neighborhood fabric. We want to see an owner occupancy element involved with ADUs because it's this special housing type. We adopted those standards, we moved them forward, and what was it? 6 months later, the state dropped and said, you can't regulate parking and you can't regulate ownership. And, you know, so we had to come back and kind of tail between my legs, hey guys, we got to change this now. And, you know,
Also known as the Keizer Amendment.
right. So it is, I think it is, obviously, it's a hard thing to look at some of these standards. And like I said, I don't want to get too in the weeds on what this model code says today, because it's not done yet. You know, the first hearing's at the end of September. They're expecting, I think, the final hearing sometime in November on this language. And I haven't had enough time to dig through and look, okay, what lives in the OAR versus the model code and what tweaks can we give? Because I also know that most model codes that come out and that have been coming out for at least the last decade have encouraged and promoted that people don't require any off-street parking. Just let the market drive it, you know, and that's clearly been something we've talked about parking a lot with this commission and in the community and as a whole, and that is not something that's going to fly with Keizer. There are some provisions in here that talk about the number of parking spaces, the max that a city can require for these proposed middle housing projects. Now, again, I don't know how much of that's in the OARs versus the draft code, because it's literally this thick of papers, 30-some pages that I was trying to dig through really quick, and so I don't remember exactly what lived in what, but there were some things like one space for a house or a duplex, encouragement to allow that one space to even be in a garage if it needed to be. So yeah, there may be some things that, and interesting enough, and then I'll get off my soapbox, but the transportation issues that are raised are absolutely valid. And I know there was a concern with transportation as a whole and infrastructure as a whole. Some communities that this is being put out there on, they don't have capacity in their water system or their sewer system, things like that. Now, in Keizer we do, so it's not going to overload our public facilities. They're going to, the developers are going to have to put in some new stuff is what's going to end up happening. But that being said, interestingly enough, these middle housing provisions, by what they're proposing, do not trigger any kind of a TPR review, a transportation planning rule review, or anything like that. Because effectively, and this is kind of why in the planning world, when this bill started coming into shape, it was kind of coined as the end of single-family residential zoning. And essentially, it's from a state level, looking at housing as saying, hey, whether or not you're a detached single-family house, or it's a duplex, or it's a row house, or a triplex, or a fourplex, that all is in more of a single-family zone area than large apartment complexes. And so it is a shift in the way of looking at housing, and it is a bill that was driven by the state housing needs issues. So, and affordability in housing. So.
Did you have a follow-up?
I do, but I changed my question. So in terms of efficiency measures, we've only been talking about the single-family residential zone. I know that in terms of multifamily development, one of the constricting factors is building height. Is that something that is even on your radar?
So, I mean, it really hasn't been as much, just from the sense that with the adoption of that RCOD zone, we're looking to that zone as being able to accommodate more of our multifamily need, and there's a taller building height, and it's 50 feet in that zone. So we haven't really looked at it as much, and I haven't been, and honestly, if I'd not gotten the email this morning, like this conversation did go totally different than I thought it was going to go to also, Mark. I really was like, hey, the 3 bullet points, let me get your take on it so I can like draft up some text amendments to bring back to you in the next couple months.
What 3 bullet points?
Yeah, right, I know.
Don't go with numbers again, please.
So the reality is that this conversation for efficiency measures really was driven out of that housing needs and buildable lands inventory discussion from a year ago, where yes, we have a need for multifamily, but that discrepancy in multifamily, we already have sort of addressed that in a really broad sweep. I mean, we've really allowed a lot more and are trying to promote a lot more of our multifamily need, as opposed to just rezoning big tracts of land to medium density. But that's absolutely something that could be looked at in that medium density zone, is to look at additional height allowances and things like that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So right now, there's a big question mark in the air. 3 issues: lot sizes, parking requirements, and middle housing for infill. That's what you're wanting input on. know, we've talked philosophically about a lot of different things here, but hearing from Commissioner Keizer and my own opinion, I'd like to hear other people's opinions on these three items and whether or not we want to look at these as first steps with the efficiency measures, or if we're going to kind of play the wait and see game. Chris Watson.
Yeah, the only one of those three measures that really makes me go, third rail is parking. Density is coming our way. We know that you talk about getting ahead of things and having to pull back. Well, we know that density is coming our way. So we know in general where we can get in line with that. So I see that as being, not necessarily non-controversial, but it's the easiest one for me to say, yes, we need to look at this because it's going to happen. So that's an easy yes for me, and something where we need to talk about it. Same with infill and mixed housing types. I feel like that's part and parcel with density in a way that parking also is, but it's easier to maybe explain to a layperson that mixed types or mixed housing, smaller density means we can have different mixed types. That conversation sort of goes together and wouldn't necessarily have the same knee-jerk reaction as, by the way, you have fewer parking options. So option 1 and option 3 to me are pretty easy to move forward with. That's me. And parking is important, but until we have a better idea of transportation, to Commissioner Keizer's point, I think parking definitely needs more information, as opposed to I would just prefer more information.
Philosophically, I don't think that reducing lot sizes is a non-starter for me. I think a lot of the lots get developed at 5,000 square feet or just over 5,000 square feet because that's the minimum. And I don't think that creating a single-family detached lot that's below that is necessarily going to lead to bad neighbor overcrowding issues, because the setbacks are the same. The bad neighbor issues that's going to bring is parking.
Right.
We all know parking is horrible on some of these infill developments, and it's just going to get worse. In that regard, I would kind of like to pause and see what some of the model code and OARs land before we make a decision on parking at least.
I also agree with the other commissioners about parking. I live in an area that everyone has at least 3 cars, usually a boat, camper. They're all parking on the street. And so I'm already in the situation where you have to pull over and let them pass and do the weaving. It is concerning to get out of my my neighborhood. I did think about that this last week. How am I going to get out of this neighborhood? It's so full. Where my brain goes, though, and I think others are saying the same thing, what do we have that we can influence on the Planning Commission? Is the state going to come back and say, you can't say anything about parking, and so we just have to adopt whatever they say? I think that would be my feedback.
I think the general tone I hear from a lot of people is we don't need more people in Keizer, right? And it's not a negative thing. I think that we've got a good community. We're the 13th largest city in the state. People think Keizer's just a small city. Well, we're really not. We're 13th in the state as far as population size. The thing we always go back to is it's not necessarily people, it's opportunity. I think some of the RCOD concepts will allow some of that opportunity, maybe not to the degree that the consultants suggested, where you have, your place of work on one floor and then you're living above that. I mean, if we're talking about reality, if you're working in a retail shop or whatever on the bottom floor, you're probably not going to be able to afford what's above that. I think the unintended consequences of the RCOD as well is we're going to be looking at lower income populations not being able to live in the neighborhoods they currently live in. So that's kind of an issue. But I think if we're going to take a swing at one of these things, maybe it's the infill portion. But again, I agree wholeheartedly with Commissioner Grants. The infill creates issues of parking. Just the other day, we had an ambulance that could hardly get down my street. My street was built in '93 with some of the more current concepts and stuff in it. Some of these other streets that you go down, Newburgh, some of these other ones, they're too narrow. If you get a bunch of street parking and things like that, granted it's gravel and stuff along the street, emergency services can be potentially impacted. You get multiple houses on fire, you got multiple fire trucks down there, it's going to have a significant impact on that. And so just adding additional density on top of that because of infill development, I think just increases the challenges for services in general. So I think we just go with the Jetsons model. It's tough. I mean, because I think that everybody in the city has a general feel for how we like our city, but we also recognize to a certain degree that the importance of trying to do what's right and trying to, but it's tough to feel the heavy hand of the state come down and say, this is what you must be doing. Well, the state in general is so far behind their building in terms of homes, it's not even funny. And that's not a Keizer issue, that's a state issue. I think the numbers I looked at a few years ago was like 20,000 homes negative every year that they generally should be building. And maybe that number's too high, but regardless, it's very high. There's a lot to consider, and I think I go back to what Commissioner Whalen said a little over a year ago, was really we have to, I think in this, especially as these rulemakings come down on House Bill 2001, we generally have to have a philosophy. And, trying to apply what the state says thou shalt in a way that is meaningful and in keeping with our neighbors out here, right? It's a tough position to be in. Sure. I don't have a solid recommendation on anything. I mean, the minimum lot sizes thing, got it, but once you go this, then you got to go this. And I think some of those provisions, specifically as it relates to the infill language, does preclude some of the things that you might need in terms of building heights and everything else like that. So, but then you go smaller, no park. It's a never-ending cycle of, you do this, what's the unintended consequence, then you do this, and all of a sudden you're constantly sort of battling yourself in some of this stuff. So, yeah, Commissioner Hostler.
When I first got into the world of planning, I did a ton of research, in cities like Houston, Texas. You can build a store next to a house. Oregon, I don't know if that would work or not. Oregon, you cannot do that. And so those are standards in which people see in Iowa, New Jersey. What did they stand for? The state says we can't regulate the parking. Parking is going to be a problem, that's for sure. What we can control, like my first sergeant told me, is the only thing you can control, private hostler, is your attitude. And so we look at what we can control, Shane. What can we control is there's neighborhoods in Portland that have lawyered up and said, this is what we're going to force the city to do. What does infill look like? It's like when you're in English. Write the description of smelling a rose. What does infill look like? We have to set a standard for Keizer and say, this is what we would want our community. This is what we want to pass down to our children. What do we want it to look like? Because I think that a lot of people would agree with that. But we're going to continue to agree with it. We're going to continue to agree with it. And so somewhere down the line, we're going to have to say, okay, this is where I think. Okay, we got to make a tentative stand and say, okay, go 5 feet above. The question is, when we have these triplexes, are we going to have alternative energy, which is another, solar or power, wind? See what I'm saying? That's in the weeds, Shane or Jeremy. That's in the weeds for sure. But that's what people do. That's how they try to get ahead in life, and save money. I think that being able to understand how the commoners think and getting their opinion and their feedback and say, okay, this is what I got from you. This is what I hear, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to make a stand right here. This is who I am. And I think that infill is where it's at. 4,000 square feet, I think, is good. That's what I think.
Don't look at me in that tone of voice.
Well, and I am to a certain degree. I mean, you've been there, done that, played the role. Commissioner Callier.
Are we considered a large city?
Yes, 25,000.
I was just looking at that and I was kind of shocked that we are considered a large city, so.
The 13th largest in the state.
Well, of course, and I hate to tell you folks, but that's not a large city.
No,
I mean, it's Oregon, perhaps, but I guess the point I was gonna make was, so we're not talking about rules applied to a few places. We're talking about rules that are applied to a town of 37,000 and a town of 500,000. Or metro areas. We're also in the same group as the metro areas. So
Yes.
the application of these rules, they're looking at, do you think they're really looking at Keizer? At
No.
37,000 people? They're looking at Portland metro area.
One size fits all.
I mean, a medium-sized community is 10,000 to 25,000.
Right.
I think we can look at that and go, well, if I was at 10,000, I might think 25 was a little big, but when you're looking at 37,000, I'm looking at 500,000.
Right. It's a massive disparity.
Well, and the ability to provide the services and such. There's nothing we can do about it. I'm just venting. But I think we need to be knowledgeable too, and I certainly had no idea that we were lumped in the same bucket as Portland and Metro Service Districts.
And I mean, to put it in a frame of reference to, some of those places, like Portland, for example, they've already done a lot of work on infill, and they've adopted way more extreme standards than even what's being proposed here. Maybe not everywhere carte blanche across the whole city, but in a lot of areas, they have some standards in place where no parking is required for multifamily development.
And I don't think right now we can look to Portland to be the example we want to follow.
No, not at all. My point is, though, Mark, is that I know that when they went through this, one of the things they did do is they looked at all of the cities and all of their lot sizes that currently are there and what their development patterns were. And like I said, I felt like on those minimum lot sizes they set, that might be a little low, although they did some analysis, did some building massing. And again, I think the one thing I would, as surprising as it is and all of that, this also is not, realistically, we have to kind of remember, this does not mean that every neighborhood is going to be all duplexes and triplexes. The market is still going to drive what the market drives.
Absolutely, and just because you have a 5,000 or 4,000 square foot lot doesn't mean you're going to have a neighborhood of 5,000 square foot lot.
That's right, and you look at the one thing we do have in Keizer though is we do have a pretty extensive track record over the last almost 20 years. Our infill chapter was adopted in, I believe, 2001, and that was an effort to say, okay, how can we better deal with some of our land? And since 2001, just about every land use application that I have processed has fallen under, not everyone, but most have fallen under that infill category of being a smaller parcel or a parcel in an existing neighborhood or whatever. And what we've seen a lot of is we've seen a lot of lots that are 15,000 square feet, quarter acre lots, something like that. They come in and they divide one lot in the backyard, or maybe two lots in the backyard, and put in an access easement and a private drive, and they create a little small neighborhood that kind of gets created. And we've seen that development pattern time and time again through, Southwest Keizer, West Keizer, some in the North Keizer area, although some of those were bigger pieces that got tracked out into subdivisions. But we've seen that in some of our neighborhoods that were developed in the 50s and the 60s that have these larger lots. And I guess what really and I think your guys' comments have been really helpful. I feel like I have a better feel. I'm definitely hearing loud and clear parking is a concern. Absolutely. I think that one of the things that I would encourage you to consider and also maybe ask for a little more input on is there information that I could provide you, or is there something you would want to see that would be helpful if we were talking about, for example, a lot size reduction? I've heard from a few commissioners, hey, maybe lot size reducing it a little bit's okay. I mean, Frank, he just straight up bust out 4,000. That's what I think is right. Okay, that's a number that's very quantifiable. I don't know if it would be helpful, but it is something that we could look at in some of those neighborhoods that have those larger lots, maybe what kind of difference there would be between a 5,000 and a 4,000 square foot lot, or a 5,000 and a 3,500 square foot lot like the RCOD. We have some other kind of built-in parameters that are already there for things like access easements that doesn't count towards lot area, dimensional standards that still have to be met, existing homes that you have to meet setbacks on. But one of the things that I would look at or would encourage you to continue to consider when we talk in efficiency measures is we've tended to want to be a city that allows some flexibility for development options for people's properties. And one of the things that I struggle with as I meet with people and talk with them is, okay, are there some small shifts that we can make that would give a little more flexibility, but maybe it results in something that's more consistent with what people are used to seeing. I could see a scenario where, frankly, a quarter-acre lot, if somebody can maybe get that one more lot out of it because the lot size is reduced to 4,000 square feet instead of 5,000, they may say, yeah, let's divide that into 3 or 4 lots. Or they wait and go, okay, now I've got this lot and now I'm going to drop a 4-plex on it instead because I can do that in the future. And I guess that's part of what I'm trying to get. And that was the bullet about middle housing as a means of infill development. I guess that was one of the things that I kind of wanted to hear a little bit of your sensitivity to. When I'm using the term middle housing, I am using that term of, kind of the row houses, the attached houses, even a triplex or a quad. I assumed I kind of knew where you were sitting on the triplex and the quad, and probably that seems like maybe a bit much for a neighborhood of all 1950s ranchers. Throwing 4-plexes in the backyard is probably not something we want to promote or push forward, is my guess. I could totally be wrong. But that's, I guess, what I'm trying to figure out is if you all as a planning commission say, hey, we've kind of seen this established infill development pattern in neighborhoods of additional single families, and we feel like what we're seeing has been appropriate over the last 10 years, and it's not too much. I guess that would be another element. Or maybe you feel like already what we're doing is too much.
Well, I almost want, because we did a lot with the RCOD, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe it's appropriate to press pause, wait to see what the outcome of the rulemaking is before we start looking at the rest of the code. Sure. Because, you'll know, I think, more by that time, whether it's January, February, March, whenever that thing gets pushed out, more of what you've seen in the RCOD and some of the demands of that might be, which may influence a discussion as it relates to the rest of the code. So, we did a lot with the RCOD, I think. And we've already seen one development. It sounds like you've got another one coming in. And so I don't know. Maybe that's more where I'm at is it's almost a wait and see to see how it's going to influence the rest of the code outside of the RCOD. Commissioner Keizer.
I'm looking at some of the information that Shane received, and they've already helped us out here with the transportation issue. It says, when a local government amends its comprehensive plan or land use regulations to allow middle housing, the local government is not required to consider whether the amendment significantly affect existing or planned transportation facilities. It doesn't say we can't, it just says we're not required to even consider transportation.
But that's such a huge factor. I mean,
Well, I absolutely agree. They've anticipated our
thoughts.
thoughts.
Well, transportation is always
Yeah.
a topic of conversation in this city. I mean, we've done, I think, a tremendous amount in some neighborhoods to be able to increase the bike ped. We looked at some of those issues where, I can't remember what they call them, but sort of the safe bike path areas through. Greenway, thank you. I was thinking Greenway, but I'm like, golf for some reason came
If
to
I'm
my head.
wrong, I sound bad now, so.
I'm sorry?
If I'm wrong now, I'm the one who sounds bad, so.
All
it's-
right. Well,
I
so
give
the
it to you.
greenway is for bicycles and stuff, and those are all things that we've kind of already looked at and stuff, but, transportation does and will remain a massive issue, I think, for our city, because I don't think it was ever intended to not have a highway running through the middle of it, or freeway running through the middle of it. That's interesting, though. That's, wow.
Okay. I have more, but I'd rather save it for another meeting.
Okay.
I think that's a good idea.
So we've had, I mean, are you walking away with anything right now? I mean.
Yes. No, I think it's helpful to have the conversation. I definitely am hearing maybe not a unanimous, this is how we should move forward, but it does give me some direction in considering things to bring before you in the next few months. Again, I think, it's good to have the conversation. I also, as we talked at last month's meeting, I felt it was appropriate to be able to especially allow Crystal and Gary to give their 2 cents on this, because they were with us through the process of the HNA and the BLI project. They've been a part of this commission for I don't even know how long. I think Gary's been a part of the planning commission from the beginning of time somehow. But no, I really did want to hear the outgoing commissioners' opinions on this. And it was very helpful to hear what you all had to say. I appreciate that. And yeah, I think obviously there are more, maybe some more questions have been raised than answers, but I think I have enough direction that if and when I bring some text amendments to you, I know what kind of information you want to have to be able to make an educated and informed decision on whether or not to recommend changes onto council, which is super helpful. And that's what I was looking for. The last thing I wanted to do was come and throw something out in front of you guys and you go, Shane, you're just an idiot. We don't want any part of this. So I think I've heard enough to get some direction. And then the other thing I just wanted to take a moment and say, Crystal, thank you so much for your service on our planning commission. It's been a pleasure to get to know you. I have always appreciated your thoughtful comments and what you bring to the table. Really, I theoretically get paid to come to these meetings. You guys do not, and I know that it can be heavy lifts and a lot of work and a lot of reading, but thank you so much for serving on planning commission. It's really been great to have you. Just as a staff person, y'all are great, but the rest of you aren't leaving yet. So, and Gary has been a staple of this city. I've worked for the city for 23 years. Gary has always been around City Hall in some capacity, always serving, an amazing Keizerite. And Gary, I've really appreciated your knowledge and your wisdom, and you are going to be greatly missed as well. So I may still call you at times and ask you questions about, things in the past and how we need to handle things.
Thank you very much.
All right. So, on the current discussion, any last oh by the ways? Saying none? Okay. Great. Staff report. Anything else you want to talk at us about?
I don't want to talk anymore, Matt.
Are you sure?
No, just a couple of things. I have a meeting, I think I mentioned that, I have a meeting next week for a kickoff meeting for that housing needs analysis update. On Monday, I got an email from our consultant on the cost of growth on the transportation grant project thing. And so I just got a copy of the draft report that talks about things being expensive. And I have a conference call with them on Friday. And I'm hoping at that conference call, I'll be able to kind of drill down with them on what our time frame is. That's been one of those projects that's kind of been out there, and there's an expectation that they're going to be coming to do a presentation either to just Planning Commission or possibly Planning Commission and Council in a joint kind of meeting. But hopefully I will know more on that. But that will be some very informative information for some real costs and traffic impacts in looking at possible growth scenarios if and when a UGB line did move. But yeah, other than that, no.
You sure?
Yeah.
All right, good. All right, Councilor Freeman, what is going on in your world?
Thank you, Chair. Well, I would be remiss if I didn't echo Shane's comments for Commissioner Wayland and Commissioner Wilson. It's always nice to have a fellow female join this group, especially because I think it's been pretty heavily male dominated. So, and I know Jane is joining the group. So thank you both for your service. And I know, Gary, you're always going to be here. So I'm sure you'll get many calls in the future.
He says he's leaving.
I know. Everyone always says that, but.
I have caller ID.
Blocked, right? So, but thank you both. And just, with that too, just thank you to all the volunteers who have been helping out this last week with animals, Matt, and everyone else that helped just do amazing things in this community. It's pretty awesome just to see all the donations that have piled in for United Way, and just the community outpour has been pretty special. So with upcoming events for the council, we do have our next meeting, which is Monday, September 21st, 7 p.m. here in the council chambers. And then just for the rest of the month, we do technically would have been another work session. We had Parks tour on Monday was canceled due to our unlucky weather that we have outside. But Monday, September 28th at 6 p.m. will be our council work session, and it's one of our city council goals, and we'll be talking about the community makeup and demographics and our diversity. So this is a work session, and we will allow some public testimony during this work session. Normally work sessions are a work session, and then public testimony happens at council in reference, but we will have some, so I'm not exactly sure what that makeup is yet. And then we have our next meeting October 5th at regular time at 7, and then another work session in October, and I'm not sure exactly what that is. On some other business, all the neighborhood associations are back to meeting. So I'm grateful for everyone to kind of maybe get back to normal, if whatever the new normal is for all of us, right? And then I'm going to give a shout out to Marion County as well. Once a month, the counselors here within the city of Keizer meet with the Marion County commissioners, and we met last Thursday for breakfast, which kind of is like, oh, I probably should have canceled that with everything else that they had to deal with. And we had breakfast, and what I've appreciated with my time on council is they're very, very informative, but just all of the work and the resources that Marion County has put into, the fire, and just making sure the communication gets out to our community I think has just been outstanding. And the information that our city manager, Chris Epley, receives twice a day from Marion County and pushes out to the counselors. And it's just been phenomenal to make sure that people know the resources that are out there and, you know, how they can help. And, you know, more resources will be coming. We're not over by any means. We're just starting. And that's, you know, I think from our community, but then, you know, the rest of the state has been pretty heavily impacted as well. And, you know, just talking about housing tonight, you know, for the record, I work for Oregon Housing and Community Services. And so we have been inundated with just housing calls and people who have lost their homes. In the Jackson County area, there's been a few manufactured home parks that have been fully, you know, decimated by the fire, and, you know, looking how do you rebuild those communities as well as all the other communities that have been impacted. So lots of work for a lot of people. So just stay tuned and we'll do the best to get information out from Keizer as long as everyone else. But that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Freeman. And I'm just going to piggyback off that. You know, when Tuesday started, Keizer responded in absolute force, going down initially just to kind of take supplies down to the fairgrounds. And what turned into Keizer taking supplies down ended up being Keizer literally running the entire effort, evacuated animals to the fairgrounds. At one point, there were more than 1,400 animals between the different the different horse barns, the livestock barns, and the poultry barn. Everything from horses to steers and cattle to turkeys and chickens and rabbits to a 200-pound tortoise. To have the opportunity to help serve people impacted by probably one of the most devastating things they'll ever experience. As a community, Keizer was there and responded. We had businesses coming in droves, donating materials and food, and, you know, Keizer businesses were there, restaurants were there, serving not only the people that had evacuated, but also volunteers. You know, Jerry Walker opened up Volcano Stadium, and there's a community of folks that are staying there. And so as a city, I think we should be very proud of what we did for our neighboring communities, and just recognize that to be able to sit here and have this conversation tonight is unique, because there's a lot of communities right now that are just trying to figure out how and where they're going to live moving into the near future. So there's still lots of opportunities to volunteer, both on the I call it sort of the people side, which is dealing directly with individuals, but also on the livestock side. I'd encourage you to go to the Marion County 4-H if you're interested in participating on the livestock side. They have signups. I think at one point it was 24 hours a day. Now I think they've scaled back just a little bit because the needs are changing. On the Jackman Long side and some of those other things, there's signups through Marion County website. You can go to the Red Cross and things like that. United Way is still taking materials, although they've now filled, I think, 2 full warehouses full of stuff. So, you know, 7 counties impacted by the fires, and a lot of human need. And the most amazing thing is just strangers grabbing each other emotionally and saying, you know what, we got you. And I think that we made the Keizer Way very apparent down at the State Fairgrounds over the course of the last week, and it makes me really proud to be part of this community. So just congratulations to all the volunteers that did that and made the best of a terrible situation. So anyhow, Council Representative Commissioner Watson, are you available on the 21st?
21st at 7 p.m.
Okay. Any other by the ways, witty statements, remarks? Commissioner Whelan, Commissioner Wilson, thank you. We stand adjourned tonight at 7:45.